Well, I think there are a lot of people here who also know a lot of about resilience. The reason why we decided to make such a lecture was that in our discussion over the last months, we needed some conceptual frameworks for building up a framework for hate crime. And the concept of resilience, whether it's explicitly addressed or not, is at the base of a lot of prevention programs and a lot of educational concepts for fostering social competences and emotional competences. And some 10 years ago or so, I started to introduce this concept into the field of German special education. And I wrote several papers about it in books and in journals in Germany about the usefulness of this concept for education, but mainly also about the critical points of this concept, because it's a very complicated, complex concept that has certain backgrounds in it. It has some advantages, but also some disadvantages. And when I proposed to use it in the context of this project, there came a new critical point up. The idea that it could be problematic within the realm of hate crime to speak of resilience, because it could be misused in a certain way. Maybe in the sense that people who are victims of hate crimes, or could be potential victims of hate crimes, could made resilient to become not a victim of a hate crime or something like that. Some members of associations and target groups in the United Kingdom made this argument, as far as I understood. And that's a funny thing, because what I wrote about resilience is also quite critical, because it's really a problematic concept. And so we decided to make a short introduction to this concept at this workshop, just to have a common base for discussions. So I'm not speaking about risk and resilience, but actually about resilience and the risks of the concept. Hope so. Sorry, I forgot to translate the sentence, but it's not so necessary for my lecture. Well, what is it? I would like to start with the historical beginnings of the concept. And in the beginning, resilience was something that could be called unexpected positive development. There have been a couple of large-scale studies, longitudinal studies, in the US and other countries, starting in the 50s, in the 1950s, which were focused on the development of people who are growing up under very adversive and risky conditions. And the goal of these studies was to find out how psychopathology is developing as a consequence of living under certain conditions, like families which are living in poverty, joblessness, delinquency, drugs, with family members who are who have depressions or other psychotic disorders. And when these studies were going on for some years, the researchers detected suddenly that there are some children in these high-risk samples who are developing, who grow up without developing psychological disorders or problems. And that was quite surprising at these times. It wasn't really expected. And some of these researchers, prominently Emmy Werner from Hawaii, called these children resilient. And that was the beginning of this kind of research, and also the beginning of the problems of this concept. And I will come to this in more details. At the same time, but with no connection to people like Emmy Werner or Alan Srove in Minnesota, there was a psychotherapist in Israel, Aaron Antonovsky, who worked with people who survived concentration camps. And of course, these people had serious psychological problems. Even they have survived concentration camps physically, they still suffered from these experiences. But nevertheless, he found out that some of these victims recovered faster and a little bit better than others. And that led him to concepts that are more or less identical with the concepts that have been developed by Emmy Werner, Alan Srove and others. But he didn't call it resilience, but salutogenesis, the origin of health. So in the concept of resilience, there's also a combination of two criteria. One is you have a high-risk sample that may be children coming from dysfunctional families, poverty, low SES, or other risk factors, or even such extreme groups as survivors of concentration camps. You look at on the development, and you can choose several criteria. You can choose their mental health, you can choose their economic striving, their biography, whether they get a job or founding a family or not. There's no clear definition which criteria you should use. And within the sample, you usually find a subsample of this high-risk group who will do well, more or less. Excuse me? If you don't understand what I'm saying, my English is not so very good, and my pronunciation also.
My question was about the SI.
Oh, that's social economic status. Excuse me. And usually in the resiliency literature, this subsample is called resilient. There are also some more abstract definitions of resiliency. These are just two out from a bundle of, I think, in the meantime, two dozen of different definitions from different authors. One is has a charming property of being quite short, from Neuker and Peterman. It says resilience is a functional adaptation to adversive conditions. And the definition beneath it from Luther, Schichet and Becker says resilience is something like a dynamic process encompassing positive adaptation within the context of significant adversity. I've chosen these two definitions because they are representing the spectrum of definitions in that field. And one of the biggest problems of the resiliency concept is to make a division between what we know from empirical studies about it and how we interpret this data and our findings. And I will come to that also. In any case, when it has been detected, when the phenomenon of resiliency, and I mean the existence of these subsamples, were detected, it was associated with a lot of optimism, of course. Because these children or juveniles or even adults were usually seen as more or less hopeless cases. So they have been singled out in policies, let's say in education policies, as people where you shouldn't spend much money in fostering them or supporting them, because they will develop problems anyway. So these studies demonstrated that this conclusion is wrong. It's always worth to invest money and work in this group, because there are some who will get out of it. So also nearly none of these studies, with the exception of Antonovsky, was focused on people who were the victims of hate crimes. These people were usually the victims of structural aggression to a certain way, because they were disadvantaged. The phenomenon is as such, the existence of the subsampled is well supported by the evidence. There have been a couple of these longitudinal and large-scale studies over the last 50 years, some of them going for a time scale of 40 years and more. These are just some of them. The Hawaii study of Emmy Werner, the Minnesota's personality study of Srau, and some German studies too. And usually you find this subsample of people who are living under very adversive conditions but are doing well. In the last 10 years or so, there has been no new longitudinal large-scale studies for a lot of reasons. It has to do with the research policies of foundations, because these studies are really expensive. You need big samples. When they started in the 50s with Emmy Werner, they had about 600 children who have been researched for 40 years. According to recent standards and statistics, you would need a sample of at least 3,000 or so, and would have to study them for at least 10 or 20 years to analyze this phenomenon in a proper way. And the last trial to make that in Europe has been in Switzerland 5 years ago with the Symposium study, which was cancelled because they had made some really silly problems with gathering genetic data. And that was the last attempt to make such a study in Europe in the last years. Newer studies or newer publications on resilience are usually focusing on smaller groups. They're usually focusing on more qualitative studies and working with groups that have been neglected by the older studies. For example, children growing up under war conditions, or refugee children, child soldiers, child workers. Studies that have been made in Israel and in Palestine sometimes, or in Africa. So in the moment, there are one of the tendencies in this field is to focus on groups that haven't been studied before. But let me now come to, before I will focus on the new tendency of community resilience, let me tell you something about how this concept works, how it is and how it is studied, because the problems of the concept are a consequence of the way it has been studied and it is interpreted. When Emmy Werner and others detected this group in the 80s, when these children were 15 or 20 years old, of course they asked themselves, what makes these people different from other people in high-risk groups who are not successful? And they had the idea that there should be some factors, personal factors within the personality of these children, and social factors in their surroundings, that are responsible for this unexpected positive development. And they call them protective factors. And they identified some of them: their communication skills, their problem-solving competences, their emotional competences, at a personal level, at a social level, certain emotional competent, significant others in their families, some mentors who could advise these children. That could be teachers or other professionals. And there are in the literature several lists of these protective factors. For example, the 5 C's of learner, who is focusing on competence, confidence, connection, character, and caring as the main protective factors, and also several others. Anne Maston, who was also one of the most influential researchers in resilience, went a step further and said the whole personality structure can more or less function as a protective factor. And that means the personality aspects of attachment, of motivation, self-regulation, cultural beliefs, and social resources in the environment of resilient people. Well, so the question arises, is this true? Are there really protective factors? And what do we know about them? Just to make the concept clear, a risk factor, and I have to apologize for the graphical issues here, is any factor, let's say a trauma or a certain living condition, that comes with a high probability for negative development, whatever negative development may be. Usually it's the development of psychological problems, but it can also be the development, the chance of getting no job or getting low educational grades or something like that. So protective factor should in any way change this probability distribution. A protective factor should increase the probability of a positive development. Also, you have you are living under a risk factor. And unfortunately, the empirical evidence that protective factors are working in that way are somewhat this concept is not so much supported by evidence as the existence of resilient people as such. That has several reasons. Most of these studies had samples that were not large enough to get a reliable measure of this interaction effect or moderator effect, as it is called in statistics. On the other hand, sometimes a certain factor was identified as protective factors in one study, but not in other studies. So there's a very mixed picture about it. So the problems of the concepts are on 2 levels. First is we have empirical support for the existence of the subsample. That's really a given in the meantime. But the problem is the conclusion from the existence of the subsample to certain properties of the sample. The essence of resilience, so to say, in a philosophical way. And the second problem is when these first findings came up in the 80s, then it also created an interesting research question, but a myth. One that became very popular afterwards. First in the US and in the UK, and in the meantime also in Germany since about 10 or 5 years. When I started to write about these things 10 years ago, nearly nobody was interested in it. But 5 years ago or 6 years ago, resilience became very important in Germany in the realm of early education and early prevention, and it became really a hype. And that's something that could be observed in the United States too, I think, and in other countries. And the popular myth is concerned with the idea that someone who is resilient is invulnerable. He should be one who can manage every risk that comes up and can strive in a positive way. And that's really nonsense. It's not supported by the data. And unfortunately, Emmy Werner, I've met her 10 years ago, sometimes when I started to bring this concept to Germany, has the responsibility for this myth, because she wrote one of her early books, was called Vulnerable but Invincible. And that this label clung to this concept of resiliency. Of course, Emmy Werner never had the idea that people are really invulnerable and would overcome any odds or something like that. She was just looking for a good title for a book, for an eye catcher. But things are happening. What struck in the public opinion and the public view was this idea of invulnerability. But also at a more scientific level, there are some problems with the concept, and I will come to them now. Yeah. Okay. And then I will jump over my slides and come to the last slides. This is a scheme of the typical design of these studies. You start with a high-risk sample at your first measurement time, and you observe this sample, let's say a year or some years later. And you have some criteria defining a good outcome, a positive outcome. And then you will find that at T2, at the second measurement point, some of these members of this sample will fulfill this positive criteria and some will not. And you call this positive subsample resilient. And then you are going back and looking what differentiates the positive ones from the negative ones. For example, by comparing means. And usually you will find differences that lead to the idea these resilient people are characterized by, let's say, more skills and more problem-solving capabilities, more self-esteem and so on. And there are some problems included in this kind of study. First of all, you don't know whether there are not any members of the high-risk sample who don't develop positive, who have also high self-esteem or high communication skills or not, because that's more or less covered by the means you are computing. But the more problematic point is, if you are interpreting it in that way, then you are confining competence and performance. So we have people who have high competences, also they are living under risky conditions, and some of them are developing positive. They are successful, but some of them are not. And the problem of resilience is that it doesn't differ as a concept between having a competence and between being successful. It merges it a little bit. So that's one problem of the concept. Actually, it's something that has to do with probabilities. If you have resources, your probability for positive development is higher than if you have no resources. But it doesn't mean that success is granted or guaranteed. Another other problem that may have to do with this is resilience is not stable. Among these resilient children, there have been individuals who became mentally ill when they became adults, or they had other problems when they became adults. And there's no clear definition how long resilience should be observed. You can observe it over a time of, let's say, 10 years, and you have a percentage of 30% resilience, and you can go 10 years longer, and then you have a percentage of, let's say, 20%, and so on. That's completely open. But the finding is it's not really stable. Another problem is in the reception of these studies, the role of social factors was underestimated. Actually, the findings showed that there are no people who are developing positively just by themselves. Usually there were some supporters, some mentors, parents, relatives, what else, who supported them and guided them and advised them. And let me come to the last of these problems and skip over the others. Even if you are looking at resources, let's say self-esteem, self-efficacy or something like that, there's a problem. We have some findings that show that a resource is not always a positive factor. One of these findings is concerned with self-esteem. Self-esteem is usually seen as a personal resource, and in a lot of psychological prevention concepts and educational concepts, self-esteem is one of the main goals, a thing that has to be fostered by all means, so to say. But self-esteem can be risky in itself. It's when self-esteem becomes very high and very positively, it overlaps with narcissism. When self-concept becomes very high and very positively, there's a growing risk that you don't perceive risks as risks, that you behave in a very dangerous manner. When self-esteem grows, you have to defend it, and the risk for defending it aggressively also arises. There are studies on high aggressive adolescents by Baumeister who are showing that these children have a very high positive self-concept. And in order to support it, they have to make hate speeches about others or something like that, or bullying them, or mobbing them, or even attacking them. Another thing that has been studied was the influence of parents or caregivers who are acceptant and emotionally competent. These are also factors that are known as being protective. And there was a study looking at children in families who are living in areas with a high incident rate of violence. And they found these connections that when at least one caregiver was acceptant and emotionally competent, the risk to develop aggressions for these juveniles was lower than if the parents were not. But it was only true when the violence in the surroundings, in the environment, was at a, let's say, at a middle level. When the violence increased, this association disappeared. Under real violent conditions, the juveniles decided that it's more adaptive to be aggressive. So what is now in the moment, what are the current trends? And that's leading me to the points we want to discuss here. The current trends in resiliency research of, on one hand, a much more strong focus on social factors. There are some prominent people who are speaking about that. Michael Unger from Canada, who coined the term resilience ecologies. That means environments that enable people to become resilient. Or the concept of community resilience. That means that it's not enough to look at resources of people, of persons, but what we have to keep in mind when it comes to prevention is the whole community in which people are living. And that means the neighborhoods, administrations, local authorities, police, schools, the whole system. And community resilience means the capability of a community to prevent aggressions or any negative events or to recover from them. I will skip the neurobiology. It's interesting, but it's getting late now. Let me just speak some words about hate crime resilience. I think from this short introduction in the topic, it's quite clear that the concept of invulnerability against hate crimes is complete nonsense. And that's not supported by the studies and also not by the authors. That's a popular misunderstanding of the concept. But I grant you, I could imagine that policymakers could use this concept in an abusive, maybe in a perverted way, to say, okay, if we are giving certain programs to, let's say, disabled people or gays or Muslims or what else, they will never suffer from a hate crime. So we don't need a hate crime law or something like that. I don't know an example for that. It's just an abstract risk that may happen or not. But the resilience concept, or at least the concept of positive development, is at least still important for the question of recovering from trauma. Because, and I think you will tell us something about that, trauma therapy is of course about fostering these resources. And hate crime is relevant because it has a focus on social support at the level of communities. What can local administrations, local structures do to prevent hate crime and to help the victims? And maybe it could also be interesting to look at communities in the other sense of the word, because in English communities are local administrations or neighborhoods, and at the same time associations or networks of people, like let's say the gay community. And I don't want to make the proposal that this kind of communities can avoid hate crimes or something like that. But in the sense of empowerment that I've mentioned before, also communities in that sense could be part of the game, so to speak, of prevention or supporting their members, making things at the policy level or something like that. And I think these 3 points are the relevant aspects of resilience when it comes to hate crime. Recovering from trauma and resilience at the level of communities, mainly at the administrative level, but maybe also at the, let's say, the network level. Okay, that was my lecture, and thank you very much for your patience.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions.
May I get a glass of water before? Thank you very much. Danke.
I have 2 reflections immediately. One is, I mean, as you say, it's very easy for the way we are construed as humans to make you jump from the result of the statistical analysis of the data to say that, okay, so it has to be a feature of the subgroup that unifies it. And of course, you can always, if you investigate these subgroups long enough, you can of course construct the concept that sort of describes such a feature if you find something. But as you say, this is problematic when you don't do these large longitudinal studies anymore, because you, in order to do that, you would have to keep doing that in order to be able to data mine into that and construct a concept that would be this is the protective factor. And of course, it's not an invulnerability factor. It seems to be also, it seems to be that the existence of a resilient subpopulation is a necessity, because it's just the other side of the concept of risk.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's a mathematical necessity, more or less. So unless the risk factor is really not a risk factor, but a guarantee of an adverse outcome, you will always have this subpopulation that sort of handles the situation well. So so that's more or less the tautology. So that's one part. So this is a problematic thing. Then I wanted to, so this is something that I guess you will need to keep in mind also when you talk about resilience on the community level.
Of course.
Yeah. So, but then I wondered a little bit about, because I think it was fascinating that some of the studies that have been made, that you have these factors like good self-esteem or something like that, whether or not it's it's a protective factor depends on other contextual elements. Then you might ask this, whether you will have this sort of complex dynamic also on the community level.
Of course.
So you can strengthen, empower a community, and this will protect the community, given certain other contextual factors. But if the situation is changed, it won't protect it anymore, or it will make the community behaving self-destructive, or something like that.
I totally agree with you, and the reason why I've focused on these problems is also prevention programs have some problems. We know that, and I think we will tell you tomorrow maybe something about that. And the flaws of prevention programs may have to do with this dynamics. Because the idea that you make a prevention program and then everything will be happy for the next 10 years or something like that.
Because I recognize it very much from the area of medicine, where you have these huge public health programs where you try to go in, detect risk factors, and then do something to prevent. And there are many well-known cases where these programs actually cause more problems than the problems they're trying to prevent. So this would be...
That's an analog to that.
Okay.
There has been, yes?
Yeah, some comments. At first, I think you gave this opportunity already. The phenomenon itself has to be defended against statistical regression procedures. So you have an extreme group, and for statistical reasons, without any psychological influence, you have a regression to the mean. And this is what the phenomenon can be, but these have to be tested. Second, I'm not an expert in the field, but I'm totally astonished about the fact that the theory assumes that prevention factors or protective factors are comparable over all different problems. So if you suffer from cancer, you have to suffer from an earthquake or become victim of a hate crime. All the protective factors are assumed to be the same.
Okay, no, that's due to my presentation. Okay.
Some comments. I would your presentation also offered a statistical approach where you said that you are comparing means. I would say it needs another design. It needs individual growth curves to test the effect. And fifth, I would say that running a lot of statistical analysis does not disband researchers from thinking.
Yeah.
So I have the impression that there is a need in theory development, and you offer some opportunities. A multi-level theory which would explain the different protective factors located, let's say, on the biological level. Maybe that some of us have biological equipment that helps us to do it better with these kinds of trauma, psychological protective factors being embedded in a network of friends may help or whatever, and as you said, societal protective factors, and then it needs in some way a theory about the interconnection between these different protective factors and how they, as moderators, may affect the process between having experienced a trauma and then what happens with you.
Well, you're right. Let me give an answer. First thing is, I don't plan to do such a study. And that's not the reason why I've presented it here. And the methodological problems of these studies are well known, actually. the CSAM study was a trial to overcome them by having, for example, a sample that's large enough to do multi-level analysis, which couldn't be done with the sample of Emmy Werner. But in the moment, the research policies don't support really big studies at this level. There's going on a study at the educational level, the Bamberger Bildungssurvey, that would be large enough to study these things, but it don't have these variables. That's a completely different background in the study. So in the moment, the discussion came to a stalemate, more or less. And the new studies that have been made were qualitative studies for two reasons. One, of course, it's cheaper, it's easier, and it's, from a methodological point of view, you can look at processes of the way how people are really processing risks in the environment. Really good by using qualitative data. And so from these studies there may come some contributions to the question how the dynamic works. But that's still in the discussion at the moment. So for our context here, the question was, would it be useful to use a concept like community resilience for something we will deliver to the European Union, given all the problems of the concept?